I am the Illinois Forest Pest Outreach Coordinator for the state of Illinois. My position is funded through the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Morton Arboretum. The Morton Arboretum is my cooperator, so I've been here 18 years, and it is such a privilege to be able to welcome all of you and also serve as the Vice President of the Illinois Forestry Association. So we have a great partnership with the Illinois Forestry Association. We've been developing webinars and field days for any and all to participate. And today is going to be a real treat. I'd like to introduce Mackenzie. Mackenzie is our program coordinator for the Illinois Forestry Association. She'll go over kind of all the nuts and bolts for today's presentation. And then we'll have some information for all of you. We're excited about welcoming Jarred, but I will let Kinsey take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Glad you all could make it out. Happy Thursday. I couldn't remember what day it was. Thursday, yay. We have a really great presentation today offered by Jarred Brooke from Purdue University. He's their wildlife extension specialist. I'll let him get into his background, but I'm assuming he'll probably want to hold off questions until the end. So he'll have about 50 minutes to present or so, and then we'll have a lot of time for questions. If you can use the chat, but there's a possibility we could unmute you. And then stick around to the end because we have some other fun events coming up. And if you're here for any continuing forestry education units, you'll want to stick around for that. All right, and I'll hand it off to Jarred.
Great, thanks, Mackenzie. I appreciate it. All right, so let me get my screen shared here. We tested this earlier, so it should work, but always issues with technology. Hold on here real quick. All right, so you should see my screen there now. Does it look all right, Mackenzie?
Yep, you're all good.
All right, perfect. So like Mackenzie said, I'm Jarred Brooke. I'm a extension wildlife specialist in your neighbor to the east, another I-state, Indiana. I work on campus here at Purdue, and then I travel all over the state doing different wildlife outreach of programs. And so kind of my specialty is habitat management for game species, in particular things like deer, turkey, quail, pheasants, and so forth. And so I'm going to talk to you today specifically about forest management for game species. But I can't talk about forest management for game species without also mentioning some of our non-game species that we may find in the same places. So on the screen there's a couple game species. We're coming on the heels of turkey season, or right in the middle of turkey season. So we'll talk a lot about wild turkeys. We'll talk about deer. But we'll also talk about some of those non-game critters that run around the forest or fly around the forest that we may be interested in well. And that picture there on the right is a summer tanager. And I have been turkey hunting the last few weeks here in Indiana. And when I'm not listening to the turkeys gobble or the hens cluck, I'm often listening for the birds calling, because those songbirds that we hear in the forest are really good barometers for the habitat quality that we may want for our game species as well. So we'll talk about that a little bit, about how we can kind of use the birds we're hearing to gauge the quality of habitat that we have for some of our other game species. And so I'll link this in the chat towards the end of the program as well. But if you scan this QR code, you can have access to my slides and then to a lot of the additional resources that I will mention during the presentation. And again, I will put a link in the chat towards the end of at the end of the presentation. That way you have that as well. But kind of what we're going to cover today is game species, their habitat requirements, talk about some forest structure and habitat quality, talk about different forest management practices that we might be able to use, and then kind of understanding how we can use forest management to achieve our wildlife objectives. Kind of a big concept that I'll cover today is based on how we can achieve our game species management goals while also providing habitat for the other wildlife species that exist within our woodlands. And this is a concept, what's called an umbrella species, basically meaning that if we do management in the name of deer, or we do management in the name of turkeys, we can benefit a lot of other non-game species who share similar habitat requirements or habitat needs, right? And so if we do management for wild turkey, say we do some sort of a forest management practice for wild turkey, species like that summer tanager or species like this red-headed woodpecker often will benefit from the same management practices. So we can kind of kill two birds with one stone by doing management for game species, but also benefiting non-game species. And this is not to say that every practice we do is going to benefit every species. There are certainly trade-offs, and we'll get into that later on. So when we talk about game species, what we're talking about are species, wildlife species that have regulated hunting and trapping seasons. And so these are species that you can harvest or that you could have harvested in the past. So some examples would be white-tailed deer, eastern wild turkey, American woodcock, ruffed grouse, squirrels, wood ducks, fur bearers like the bobcat pictured there. Those are species that we consider game species. So there's a harvestable population of those individuals. When we talk about kind of forest edge game species, those are ones that we will find around the edges of forest, but maybe more in kind of grasslands or shrubland areas, things like mourning dove, bobwhite, and cottontail. And so we may touch on those species a little bit, but we're going to focus more on these kind of forest game species. And when we talk about managing for game species, especially as landowners, often what we control is we control the habitat, right? So we may have individuals of a species on our property, but what we really control is the habitat and the habitat quality for those species. And habitat is just four things, and it's the food, space, water, and cover that an individual or a population needs to survive and reproduce. So it's got to have food, water, and cover. All those things are needed, and they're needed in a certain amount of space for that species to be able to thrive and live its life out, right? And that could be different amount of area. We're talking about a woodland salamander. A woodland salamander can live its whole life in about a 3 foot by 3 foot square, right? They don't need a lot of habitat because a lot of area because they don't move very much. But if we're talking about a bobcat, bobcats can have home ranges of 10 to 100 square miles, so a lot more space. And the important thing to remember about habitat is that it is species or life stage specific, right? So deer habitat is not the same as ovenbird habitat, even though deer and ovenbirds both live in a forest. They have different food requirements, different water requirements, different cover requirements, and different space requirements. They may be overlapping, but they are unique and they are different to that species. When we talk about life stage specific, we're talking about the idea that where a turkey will raise their young, their brood, is not the exact same conditions as where a turkey will nest. They may overlap and there may be some similarities, but they have different kind of needs to where they're going to raise their brood versus where they're going to nest. And so we kind of have to think about how can we create the vegetation that a turkey will need throughout all of its life stages, from being an adult to raising young to nesting to strutting to all those different things. And just kind of give you a visual concept of that idea is this is just an aerial image of a farm in Indiana, and it kind of shows you the relationship between water, food, and cover and food. And the idea here is that the closer we can have all of these resources together, in general, the higher the quality of habitat we have, right? If we had a woodland and the entire woodland was closed canopy forest, maybe it's only providing cover for an individual species. But if we have these mix of vegetation types or mix of forest ages, then we have kind of more habitat diversity, which can get us more wildlife diversity. And to kind of take the concept of habitat being species specific a little bit further, we have two pictures here. On the left is what I would consider very high quality ovenbird habitat. So ovenbird is this little bird here, and they live their life on the forest floor. And they really need this leaf litter that doesn't have a lot of vegetation on the ground level in order to nest in the leaf litter and find insects and find seed and food in the leaf litter. So this kind of closed canopy forest with very little understory is very good ovenbird habitat. Contrast that to the picture here on the right, which is what we would consider an open canopy forest that has big mature trees, but it has sunlight coming through the canopy and reaching the understory, which results in this kind of thick and dense green understory of different plants. This is very good turkey brood habitat, because what turkey broods need is that they need vegetation on the ground level in the understory to attract insects, but also to hide those turkey poults that are 6 to 12 inches tall. But the hen turkey doesn't want the vegetation so tall that she can't see over the vegetation and see predators or other things coming their way. But this is not good ovenbird habitat because there is too much vegetation on the ground level for ovenbirds to be able to nest and then glean insects and other food off the understory. They're still both forests. They just look different and have different values to different species. So kind of to give us an understanding of some habitat requirements for the different game species, white-tailed deer are considered generalists. They exist almost everywhere across Illinois and Indiana. They can live in very urban environments. They can live just about anywhere, right? They can live in neighborhoods. They can live in forested areas. They can live in cropland areas. But in general, their cover that they need is kind of dense woody vegetation, as well as tall early successional vegetation, which would be like old fields or grasslands that include native grasses, forbs or wildflowers and shrubs. And they use mature forest areas for foraging as well, for finding acorns, for finding different vegetation. What they eat is generally forbs or wildflowers, which are kind of deciduous or kind of broadleaf herbaceous plants, browse, which are woody stems, acorns and beech nuts in the fall, soft mast like persimmons in the fall, or maybe blackberries in the summer, grains like corn, wheat, and then grasses like wheat, but they generally do not eat that many grasses. They obtain their water from their diet, but also drink freestanding water. And the space requirements they have is roughly a square mile, maybe a little bit smaller, a little bit bigger, depending on where they live. And just to kind of give us a better understanding of some of the things that deer eat, there was a research project in Indiana a few years ago that looked at what are some of the woody species that deer really prefer. And this is important in helping us understand the quality of the wood and the amount of food that we have in a woodland. So on the left there, you have what are called highly selected plants. These are plants that would be like ice cream to deer, meaning that they are species that deer are going to be looking for to try to find to be able to consume. And so you have things on there like oaks, black gum. A surprising one that people don't think about often is greenbrier. So the plant that has a lot of thorns on it, deer really, really like to eat greenbrier. And so these are things that deer would prefer to eat. If we work our way down the list, we get all the way down to highly avoided. And again, these are plants woody plants where deer are consuming the woody vegetation from it, not necessarily the fruit. And if there's some commonalities that we see in that highly avoided area, or even slightly avoided area. It often tends to be a lot of our invasive species. Amwar honeysuckle or bush honeysuckle, autumn olive, Marrow's honeysuckle, multiflora rose, Tartarian honeysuckle, wing burning bush, Japanese barberry. A lot of those species are very highly or slightly avoided. And so if our woodland is dominated by invasive species, that means the habitat quality and the food quality in our woodland from a deer's perspective is very low. When we come to wild turkey, they're also generalist, but they have pretty more specific needs depending on the life stage that they're in. They can use things like mature forest, young regenerating forest, brushy areas, shrubby areas, old fields or pastures for nesting. They use mature forests and herbaceous openings and grain fields for foraging, young forests and herbaceous areas for brood rearing. And then they use trees or tall shrubs for roosting throughout the year. They have a varied diet. In the fall, they're eating a lot of hard mast, so things like acorns or beech nuts. They're also eating soft mast like berries, seeds, waste grain, and leaves of grasses and forbs throughout the year. And then they're also eating insects, but those insects are extremely important for hens prior to nesting so that they have that extra protein. And then also for those young poults, they're almost eating exclusively insects while they're growing, especially for the first 2 to 3 weeks of their life. They will use freestanding water, but their their water is often obtained through their diet. And then they can have a home range anywhere from 1 to 4 square miles. American woodcock is another one. These are a young forest specialist, meaning they really thrive in kind of dense, short, regenerating forest openings. They use kind of old fields or grassland areas with sparse cover for their courtship or roosting when they're migrating through in the spring. They use 2 to 25-year-old hardwood stands or shrub cover, especially in moist areas for foraging, nesting, and brood rearing, and during migration. They are almost exclusively eating invertebrates, and it tends to be 60% or more earthworms. And so they tend to be found in moist areas where there's a lot of earthworms. They obtain most of their water from their diet. And as far as how much space they use, they're migratory. And in the breeding season, they can be found in areas of about 150 acres. But during migration, they can be found in very small woodlots. They're found in very few acre woodlots as they migrate through. Ruffed grouse is another one that we'll find. It's very rare. It's actually an endangered species here in Indiana. But as you go farther north into Michigan, Wisconsin, other states like that, it's fairly common. They're another young forest specialist. They use those kind of 6 to 20-year-old forest stands, maybe after a harvest or after a tornado, that have very dense stems throughout the year. They also like mature forest in close proximity to the young stands that can be used to feed on acorn or other mast. And they'll use a variety of forest types and stand ages for nesting. They're eating buds off of trees, especially aspen. They're also eating hard and soft mast like acorns or berries, insects, and then leaves of forbs as well. They often obtain their water from their diet, and they have a home range anywhere from 25 to 150 acres. Northern bobwhite, again, one of those kind of forest edge shrubland or grassland specialists. They're using shrub cover like blackberry thickets or bramble thickets for escape and thermoregulation throughout the year. They're using old fields or grassland areas with wildflowers or forbs and grasses for nesting and brood rearing. Very similar to turkeys, the young quail eat almost exclusively insects in the summer, whereas the adults eat a variety of seeds, green vegetation, invertebrates, waste grain, and hard and soft mast. They obtain most of their diet or most of their water through their diet, and they have a home range of anywhere between 25 and 100 acres. So now that we have an understanding of what are some of these habitat requirements of different game species, now it's important to think about how does forest age, so how old a forest is, plant succession, and then forest structure influence wildlife and wildlife habitat. So in general, when we think about managing a forest for specific wildlife species, we're thinking about managing where the light is. And where the sunlight is where the food and cover is going to be. So in a closed canopy forest, the sunlight is going to be in the canopy in the mid-story. So there's going to be very little sunlight reaching the forest floor. Thus, there's going to be very little vegetation in the forest floor. In an open canopy forest, like the picture there to the right, where you have gaps in the canopy, maybe from a tree dying of old age, or from a tree being blown over from a windstorm, or from a tree being harvested, you're going to have sunlight in both the canopy and sunlight on the forest floor. Therefore, you're going to have food and cover on the forest floor, but also in the canopy. We also need to think about kind of plant succession over time. And this graphic gives you the example of if we had an agricultural field, that kind of disturbed soil there on the left, and we stopped farming it, in 30 to 40 years, that field would turn into a woodland and forest. But over those 30 or 40 years, it would go through this progression of changes in plant community. First, you would have what's called the old field or early successional stage, where that field would be dominated by annual weeds, things like ragweed and foxtail and others. Then you would have perennial grasses and weeds or forbs coming in, things like tall goldenrod or common milkweed or broom sedge or little bluestem would come in there. Then you would move to that kind of thicket stage or that mid-successional stage, where you would have a lot of kind of wind-blown woody plants would come in there, or seeds from shrubs or that would be deposited by birds or other wildlife. So you'd have things like cedars or cottonwoods, or you would have brambles like blackberry would be in that kind of thicket stage. And then once you kind of go out of that thicket stage, then you're in that kind of forest stage, and that we would call late succession. And on that kind of left side of the forest stage is what we would call young forest, and then the right side is what we would call mature forest or old growth forest. And those different forest stages have different values for wildlife. On that young forest stage, we typically have a lot of forage, a lot of green growing vegetation that can feed herbivores. We also tend to have lots of browse, lots of woody plants that are at the level where a deer or a rabbit could eat them. We also tend to have a lot of cover, so a lot of vegetation at the ground level that can hide wildlife. And we also tend to have a lot of soft mass, so things like blackberries, gooseberries, roses. But what we don't have is we don't have a lot of hard mass like acorns or beech nuts or hickories, or cavities or snags which are standing dead trees or cavities in trees, which we tend to get more of in those kind of older stages of forest. So the idea here would be that if we are trying to maximize the value of our woodland for various wildlife species, we would want to have forest stands in different ages, from young forest all the way to mature forest. Because those different ages are going to have different values to wildlife because they have different structures. And so when I talk about structure, what we're talking about is, in this picture, is vertical structure, which is basically thinking of like the layers of a cake, right? So different layers of cake have different, they're made up of different things, and they have different values to the overall taste of the cake. In this case, the different layers of the forest have different values to different wildlife species. And the layers that we're thinking about are the canopy. So that's where that kind of green vegetation of the trees are. We have this mid-story layer, which is kind of like above the ground but below the canopy of the trees. And then we have understory, which is basically the ground level and kind of 2 or 3 feet or 4 or 5 feet off the ground. This is an example of a mature forest that's probably 60 to 80 years old. And you can see here that most all of the sunlight in this example is going to be being captured by the canopy in the mid-story, which results in very little understory vegetation. The only thing that is living here in the understory, plant-wise, are things that can tolerate a lot of shade. And from a deer perspective, there's only 50 to 100 pounds of deer forage in this stand here. Contrast that to also another mature forest, but a mature forest with an open canopy. In this woodland here, you can see we have a canopy up here, but there's lots of gaps in the canopy that is allowing sunlight to reach the forest floor. And this example here, the mid-story is almost completely gone because we removed it. Now you have sunlight reaching the forest floor, and you can see that the sunlight layers here. That is resulting in a lot of green growing vegetation on the understory, which is creating a lot of food in the neighborhood of 200 to 600 pounds of deer forage per acre in this kind of open canopy mature forest. We can kind of take that all the way to the other extreme where we have, this is a clear cut or a forest regeneration opening where the understory and the canopy are essentially the same because all of those woody plants are now 4 to 5 feet tall, maybe a little bit taller. And so the understory and the canopy are all the same thing. And this is still a forest. It is just what we would call a young forest because all of those woody plants are young in age. They're thick, dense cover that's providing very different resources compared to that kind of mature forest. And in this case, it's providing 6 to 1,000 pounds of deer forage per acre. So now that we have an idea of kind of habitat structure, it's important to think about, forest structure and forest age. It's important to think about how we can merge the habitat needs of different wildlife species with our understanding of forest structure and forest age, and then create habitat or improve habitat for those various species. And I just want to kind of give you some understandings of how we think about habitat management for wildlife. So in general, when we think about managing habitat, we're thinking about managing plant succession by managing where the sunlight is and what plants are represented in the forest or in the areas we're managing, right? So we're trying to decide where we want the sunlight based on the habitat needs of those species. In the canopy, in the understory, in both the canopy and understory. Habitat management is also a decision. So we often decide to do something based on improving it for various wildlife species. There are always trade-offs with habitat management. So think back to the case of if we manage a forest for really good turkey brood habitat, or at least an area of the forest for really good turkey brood habitat, like the picture I showed you earlier, it's not necessarily going to be good ovenbird habitat. We can have other areas of our woodland or of our forest be good ovenbird habitat, but they have different habitat needs. So the decision to do no management is still an option, but that is still a decision. So you are deciding that the condition of your forest as it is today is what you would like to maintain it in, and that may be good for some species and may be bad for other species. So in general, managing wildlife is managing habitat, and managing habitat is managing plants and sunlight. So that's what we think about. We think a lot about what plants are we managing for to create the habitat we want. So just a few quotes related to forest management for wildlife that I think are important to consider as you navigate what to do in your woodland. So I'm sure folks are familiar with Aldo Leopold, who wrote a really good book called A Sand County Almanac. And if you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it. And the quote here is that a conservationist is one who is humbly aware that each stroke of an axe, he is writing his signature on the face of the land. So every decision that we make as landowners or land managers is shaping that forest in a certain way to manage for certain wildlife species or against other wildlife species. The other important thing is that to think about is to keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. So this quote kind of relates to, we don't want to wholeheartedly get rid of any certain native species, right? We want to manage for a balance, but we want to keep all of the important parts of that forest and of that woodland in mind when we're managing. So some habitat management considerations related to landowners is thinking about what are your goals and objectives? So what are you hoping to achieve? Are there certain wildlife species you're hoping to attract? What is the current condition of your habitat or your forest? What is limiting in your woods? So thinking about what might be limiting wildlife in your property, and then what are your property limitations? For example, you may not have all the equipment that you need to use a tool called prescribed fire on your woodlands. So that may be a limitation. Also, you may own a woodland in central Illinois that is 40 acres, and you may be interested in grouse, but the likelihood that you're going to get grouse in a 40-acre woodland in central Illinois is basically zero because there are no grouse in that area, right? So that is a property limitation. You can manage for grouse habitat, but you won't have grouse respond in that case because they just aren't in that area. So you need to think about things like goals, objectives, and then also management actions. And here's an example. In this example, a landowner in southern Indiana is really interested in managing for the northern bobwhite on their 200-acre farm. So their goal is to improve habitat for northern bobwhite, but also still generate income from the farm. Their objectives might be to improve brooding and nesting areas for bobwhite in order to achieve their goal of improving habitat for bobwhite. An action they may take to improve brooding and nesting areas for bobwhite would be to create native grass and wildflower field borders around crop fields through the Conservation Reserve Program, right? So that is the specific action that will achieve their objective, that will help achieve their goal. So thinking that's just a frame to think about how we would approach management. And then we need to think about where we're going to focus our management. Oftentimes, landowners that are very interested in game species want to focus their management on food plots. But I would argue that most of your effort is going to be better spent managing your forests and managing your fields first, and then thinking about supplementing your management with food plots. Forest management and field management are going to have a lot more impact, generally because most properties, and this is an example of a property here, are going to be, or a lot of properties where people are doing management are going to be more forested or have more fields than they are food plot. What I see often is that a landowner may spend 60% of their time managing the 5% of their property that's food plots, and spend 5% of their time managing the 80% of the land that is forested. And this is just a rough example here. But spending your time managing the 80% of forest and the 15% of fields is going to have more of an impact overall on deer, on turkey, on other wildlife species than spending 60% of your time managing the 5% of your food plots. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But for this talk, we're going to kind of focus on forest management for wildlife. And so thinking about managing the forest composition and structure through managing sunlight. And if we can create structural diversity, we can then create wildlife diversity. And our management needs to match the habitat requirements of the species that we are trying to manage for, right? So if our management doesn't meet the needs of wild turkey, and wild turkeys are our objective, then we're not going to be enhancing habitat for wild turkey. When it comes to forest management, we can think about different aspects of how we might manage that forest. We can do what's called regenerating the stand, which is creating kind of a new forest, and that can be done through a timber harvest. We can kind of improve the existing stand that we have or existing forest we have, often through forest stand improvement. We can leave the stand and not really do anything to it, and that would be not doing any management. Or we could clear the stand, get rid of the stand of forest, and then create old field, create a food plot, or other options. So we're going to kind of focus our talk, the rest of the talk today, on these two type of things here: regenerating the stand or improving the stand. So when we think about forest regeneration, we're thinking about how to create the next generation of forest. When we think about forest stand improvement, we're thinking about what things can we do to improve that forest for a specific reason. And these are kind of just a bevy of different kind of management options that you would have, whether you're looking at forest stand regeneration or forest stand improvement. We're going to start with that forest regeneration and think about, if we are interested in harvesting timber, some considerations that we might take into account if wildlife are our objective. Timber harvest and wildlife are certainly compatible, and we can really tailor our timber harvesting to meeting our wildlife objectives. Some things to consider would be controlling invasive species before we harvest, keeping hard and soft mass producing trees, things like oaks, hickories, black gum, or persimmon. They're going to be providing some sort of nut or some sort of fruit. You don't have to keep all of them, but you should just keep some of them around to provide food for wildlife. You may also want to keep snags or living cavity trees, or trees that we would call wildlife trees that have kind of big sprawling branches that may produce a lot of acorns or be roost trees for turkeys. And the best methods for harvesting timber for wildlife in your property is going to depend on your property and your focal species. So often the best advice is to consult with a forester and consult with a wildlife biologist, which are often free services, to understand how timber harvest might be used on your property or might not be used on your property to manage wildlife. And so we're just going to kind of go through a few examples of different ways we could harvest timber or not harvest timber to provide habitat for wildlife. In this example, we're not going to harvest at all. We're just going to maintain our forest as a mature forest. This may limit the amount of browse or forage for deer. It's certainly going to limit the amount of cover for deer and turkey. We're going to maintain roost trees that are available for turkeys, and we're going to maintain hard mast if they're already on site, things like hickories and oaks. This type of management or no management can be good for squirrels, mature songbirds, bats, woodland salamanders. Deer and turkey will use these areas, but they can be made better for deer and turkey through different management. So this is an example of a mature forest here. Most of our sunlight is going to be captured by that overstory and that midstory, which is going to result in kind of very little understory vegetation. We can do what's called single tree selection, which is going to increase the amount of food we have for, say, deer, or increase the understory, but only by kind of a limited amount because we're only creating small little gaps in the canopy that lets a little bit of sunlight in. And this is an example of a single tree selection opening where we have harvested a tree out of this gap, and now we have sunlight reaching the forest floor, and now we have some vegetation in the understory. We can do what's called group selection or patch cuts, and this is going to create more food and more cover for deer and for turkey because we're creating larger gaps in the canopy. And so this could be a gap the size of maybe like a half acre to a couple acres in size. And that's going to create a lot of browse and cover and a lot of soft mast. So this might be what a canopy gap would look like in a forest. And this canopy this gap is probably 2 acres in size, but the forest around it is probably 75 to 100 acres. So relatively small, 2% of that 100-acre woods. From the ground, this is what it's going to look like, and this is going to create a lot of food and a lot of cover on the ground level. Most of these plants in here are going to be blackberry or some other woody plants that are going to be providing browse, cover, and also soft mast. A shelter wood harvest is a different type of regeneration method where we are kind of creating different sized gaps in the canopy, and we're really trying to leave oaks and hickories in the overstory. This is going to create a variety of different conditions throughout the stand where we have increased forage, browse, soft mast, and cover, but we're going to retain those hard mast producing species like oaks to have so we can have the hard mast. And this is an example here of where we would have a shelter wood. So we have large oaks and hickories retained, but also have a lot of varied sunlight in the understory, which is creating a lot of different light conditions and a lot of understory vegetation, which is good food and cover for wildlife. We can also think about clear cuts, and this may be an appropriate management action for a forest, depending on your goals and objectives and the size of the forest. We can create a lot of food and a lot of cover for deer, turkeys, and grouse and other wildlife through clear cuts, and these tend to be multiple acres to 20, 30, 40 acres in size, depending on the size of woodland. The downside here is that we lose all of those hard mass producing species at least for 20 to 40 years until they return to that stand or get big enough to produce acorns. And this is what a clear cut would look like. So this is about 4 or 5 years after a clear cut. It's now a young forest, and most of that vegetation in there is blackberries, at least for that time, which produces a lot of soft mast. when we think about, so that's the kind of the harvest or timber harvest options. Now we can think about improving our current stand for wildlife through forest stand improvement. And generally our goal is to make the stand better for wildlife or another objective. We often want to keep soft and hard mass trees, keep snags or living cavity trees, which are going to provide habitat for wildlife. And these are generally going to cost money and time, whereas timber harvests are often going to make you money on your woodland. First and foremost, if we work to control invasive species, we can improve our woodland for a lot of different wildlife species. If you look back or think back to that chart I showed you for species that deer often avoid, they are often our invasive species. So just by removing these species and having more native species, we can improve them for wildlife. This is a stand here that I wish I had a before picture, because this entire stand was solid bush honeysuckle. And then we went in and we removed all of that bush honeysuckle with a forest mulcher. And now in the understory is all of these good native plants like this wing stem here, ironweed, and other kind of wildflowers that are coming up. Crop tree release is another forest stand improvement practice. And this is the idea that we are releasing or allowing species like this white oak here to have more room to grow the canopy larger, which would then help that tree to A, be bigger, and B, potentially produce more acorns. And so we did some research on this when I lived in Tennessee. And what we found was that in general, crown releasing or crop tree releasing, which is the idea of killing trees that are competing with an oak tree, on average, it increased acorn production by 65%. So if you want more acorns, crown releasing or crop tree releasing those oak trees can be a very good practice. We can also think about what we call wildlife improvement cuts or thinning or wildlife retention cuts, where we selectively remove trees that have kind of lower food and cover values for wildlife, things like some of our maples, things like ironwood and others, and retain mass-producing species like hickory, beech, black gum, oaks, and others. And this helps open the canopy so that more sunlight gets to the ground floor, and we can create a stand that looks something like this. We went in here, we removed and killed a lot of maple trees, but also some of these beech. And this is about 2 years after we did that work. And as we were walking through this stand, and this is a private woodland in Indiana, we found this deer fawn bedded in this opening because of all the food and all the cover that's in those areas. We can also think about prescribed fire as a tool to increase forage, browse, and soft mast. It's beneficial to a lot of different wildlife species, but also helps promote oak and hickory regeneration. This is a stand that we use prescribed fire on, and this is the summer after a March prescribed fire. And this is almost all of that understory there are little baby oak trees that sprouted up from acorns. And so oaks really like fire, and we can use fire as a way to enhance wildlife habitat, but also create new oak and hickory seedlings. And so now what I want to do is I kind of want to walk you through an example of how we might couple some of these tools, these forest stand improvement tools, together to manage the stand specifically for, say, wild turkeys or deer. So this is an example of kind of an unmanaged mature forest where we don't have very much understory. And then this next picture was taken a couple years later, kind of over in this area here. So this is that same stand just on the hillside where we did invasive species control on this slope here, plus a prescribed fire. And the invasive species that we were having trouble with here were bush honeysuckle and winged burning bush. So we sprayed those invasive species, plus we did one prescribed fire, and now we have a pretty robust understory, which is providing food and cover for deer and turkey. A few years later, we did another prescribed fire, and we did what's called that shelterwood harvest, where we removed some overstory trees, but kind of left our white oaks and our black oaks and some of our hickory trees. And this is the vegetation that resulted. And I want you to pay attention to that yellow box there, that number tree 14, as you'll see it coming up over time. So we've done 2 prescribed fires now, invasive species control and shelterwood. This is that same spot a year later, looks pretty similar. This is that same tree another year later, and you can see now that tree 14 is, at least the 14 is starting to be covered by kind of woody vegetation as that woody vegetation grows up. So we did another prescribed fire in November of 2022. This is what that site looked like shortly after the prescribed fire. This is what that same site looked like the spring after the prescribed fire. And so there's tree 14. This is what that same site looked like in July. And so now we have a lot of vegetation that's shorter, and so providing better kind of brood cover for wild turkeys. A couple years later, we decided to burn that stand again. This is tree 14 2 years later before a prescribed fire. And again, you can see the number 14 is obscured by woody vegetation. This is during the fire. This is in May after the fire. You can kind of see tree 14 a little bit there. All this woody vegetation is now dead, and we have more understory forbs and grasses growing here. This is what the understory looked like after that prescribed fire in May. That fire was done in April. This is what it looked like in May. There's lots of cool plants like woodland sunflower, lots of little baby oaks, lots of things like hog peanut and cool goldenrod species that are coming up after that prescribed fire. And this is what that site looked like in July of 2025. And we have lots of sunlight coming in here. We reduced those woody plants, and now we have a lot of herbaceous vegetation showing up in that understory. That's providing good food, good cover for turkeys, broods, but also for deer and a variety of other wildlife species. So we can take that stand that was unmanaged in the beginning, and we can create a stand that's really, really good for deer, for turkey, for our game species, but also benefits things like red-headed woodpeckers or summer tanagers or Indiana bats or box turtles. So again, going back to that concept of umbrella species management for deer and turkey that also benefits a whole host of other species. So kind of bringing this full circle, thinking about we have lots of options to manage game species in our woodlands that can also benefit a lot of non-game species. When we think about managing forests, we're thinking about managing sunlight and managing plants so that they can benefit the species that we're interested in. And that management must match the species habitat requirements that we're trying to manage for. This can be very overwhelming, and it can be lots of options. So the best advice I can give you is to consult with a forester and consult with a biologist who can help you identify the management options that best meet your woodland and best meet your management objectives. And ideally, you're going to think about starting small. So thinking about maybe I want to control invasive species on this 5 acres rather than on this 100 acres. So before we break for questions, I kind of wanted to give you some additional resources. We have all kinds of publications and podcasts if you're interested in kind of learning more about this. And again, these resources will be linked to that QR code and then linked into the chat, the link I put in the chat here in a minute. We also have a new online course for landowners and conservation professionals related to managing your woodlands for birds, both songbirds and game birds like turkeys. And that's called Forestry for the Birds. And with that, I took up more time than I wanted to, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that folks may have about anything related to forest management for wildlife. So I appreciate the time, and I'll stop there for questions.
Excellent presentation, Jarred. Really, it was phenomenal. And thank you so much for sharing all of your resources. That is wonderful. I can unmute everybody if we have just a few minutes. People, I allow. Yes. Okay, good. If people have questions, you want to raise your hand. I think we have a few minutes for Jarred and Kinsey. I don't know if you see anything in the chat.
I don't see anything in the chat, but yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and just start speaking. We have about 10 more minutes.
There's a question from Emily. How do you feel about invasive species like honeysuckle?
Hopefully it was clear in my presentation I'm not a fan. They create all kinds of issues, and deer will eat honeysuckle, but only if they are forced to. Only if that is the it's only if that's the only thing they have to eat. That's about it. So I think one of the easiest ways that landowners can improve their properties is just through invasive species control. Is kind of the place I would start. And so real quick, I'm going to put the link to the resources in the chat. So
excellent. Thank you. I have a quick question for you. When you talked about food plots and having those unique food plots set aside for management and different species, how do you feel about kind of the management of invasive species with using herbicides and then having it be included in a food plot?
Yeah, so I think we can't manage invasive species totally without herbicides. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? Like we can use goats to manage invasive species, but goats are not going to completely control invasive species. They're going to keep them short, but they're still going to resprout. So often herbicide is needed after that initial going through with grazing with goats. There are ways you can limit the amount of herbicides you would use in food plots through using regenerative ag techniques, cover crops, and others. But I think the important thing to think about is just judicious use of herbicide, right? So not spraying willy-nilly, not only using the herbicide that you need to kind of get the management done that you need.
Great, thank you.
I see a couple more chats.
Go ahead, you want to call it out?
Yeah. Emily also asks, are you worried about the current presidential administration chipping away at natural lands? What preservation can be done at the state and local level?
Well, there's always, of course, concerns. I think public lands are extremely important, and they belong to all of us, and so we should all have a say in how they're managed. But I think a larger thing to think about in Indiana and Illinois is that we are over 90% privately owned. And so what we can control as private landowners is how we manage our land. And we have the ability to decide how we want to manage that land, right? It is equally, you have the ability to decide that I want to manage my land for whatever species. So I think what I think about a lot is how can we manage private land collectively in order to benefit wildlife in general, because we own a lot of private land, right? But how can we manage that in the best ways possible?
Just comment on how can we encourage more prescribed burning? And I love that question.
I um, I think one of the coolest things coming on the horizon related to prescribed fire, and Illinois has a couple, are these ideas of what's called a prescribed burn association. Instead, that is a neighbors helping neighbors type model of where neighbors get together and they utilize prescribed fire. So if let's say I am a neighbor with Mackenzie, maybe I have the experience with prescribed fire, maybe Mackenzie doesn't, but she has property she wants to burn. Well, she can come help me burn my property and we'll share equipment, and then I'll go help her burn her property and share equipment. So neighbors can share resources, share experiences, and kind of collectively work together to get more prescribed fire in the landscape.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. Kinsey, do you want to put up your screen? It's just after 12. I think you have
Yep.
some information. Jarred, we can't thank you enough, and you shared your contact information, you shared the resources, and so we really appreciate it. We will be hosting this webinar on our YouTube channel. And Kinsey, I think you have a couple other announcements.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to get my screen up here. Yeah, well, thanks everybody for making it out. This was a really awesome webinar, and thank you so much, Jared, for presenting. Um, Yeah, I have a few announcements. There's quite a few QR codes on the screen here. If you're interested, please join the Illinois Forestry Association. You'd receive quarterly newsletters. You'll be the first to hear about our events. And we also even offer a free membership option. And you can scan that QR code or just head over to our website, isleforestry.org, and head to the Join tab to learn more. We have one last From Canopy to Understory webinar series that's happening next Tuesday, May 12th at 11:30. Free to register. If you scan that QR code, easy peasy, or you can head to our website to the events tab and sign up through there. And then couple more things. If you are here for a SAF CFE, you can scan that QR code and receive the 1 credit for attending this. Um, I'm also going to send out an email after this to all of you who came, and I will send you the link once I'm able to get this uploaded to YouTube. And I'll also send the SAF CFE link as well if you missed this QR code and some more information about the upcoming events that we have, which also include our family forestry field day. We're about a week and a half away, and it's really exciting opportunity for both adults and children to learn about forestry. So the youth program is going to focus on wildlife, soil, birds, trees. There's fun craft activities for them. And then for adults, we've got forest foraging, we've got managing forests. There's a lot of different topics. If you want to learn more, you can scan that QR code, or again, you can go to our events tab and take a look there. I've uploaded the event program so you can see all the presenters, all the topics, as well as presenter descriptions. And adult registration is 15, and then for children, it varies by how old they are. We're going to have lunch provided, and there's also free trees for everybody who attends. There's a lot of trees, so you'll get a tree for sure. If you do end up attending this, we're really excited. And I'll pass it back to Trisha in case I missed anything.
No, that's great, Kinsey. Thank you to everybody who joined us today. It was a pleasure, Jarred. Again, thank you very much. It was a great presentation. Your resources are phenomenal, and we are grateful for your support. And so with that, I will say goodbye. Hope to see everybody next week, and I hope to see everybody at the Family Forestry Day in Pecatonica, Illinois. It'll be a good program, a good event. So register now. All right, everybody, take care. Have a great day. Thank you.